In the war, being a child was very, very different from today. I was 2 when the war started, and then I went to school when I was 4. And it was winter time, I believe, and we wore black stockings and a black gym slip with a little square top and a black velour hat. And I walked about 2 miles to school, and I was bullied by a couple of older girls. And in the end, I told my father, and he had been a great footballer, and he could run. And as he was walking to meet me one afternoon, he saw what was happening, and he ran after the girls, and they never bullied me again. My father was in the Home Guard to start with during the war, and about 2 miles down from Pagham Harbour we lived, and he used to cycle every evening down to Pagham Harbour, and there was a little hut there that he used to sit there and watch in case any of the Germans were coming over the channel, and then come back on his cycle. He then went into the RAF and became an armourer, much to the disgust of his family, who all went in the Navy. They were very upset that he went into the RAF, but that's what he wished to do. The impact it had was that when I went to a bigger school, I used to go on the bus, and when we heard the sirens, all of us had to go in a long line, a crocodile, across the playground and down the steps into this enormous shelter that I can still smell to this day, of musty damp. And we used to have to sit there until the siren went again to tell us that it was all clear. I can't remember that we ever did anything much in the shelter, but then we would come back, and then I would have, after school finished, I would have to walk to the bus stop and come home on the bus. When we were at home, we first of all had an Anderson shelter across the bed, and we all crept underneath that, and then the next door neighbour had a proper shelter built, and so we used to go through the fence and down into her shelter, which was much smaller, of course, and the neighbours would be there and chatting, and then when the all clear went, we would come back. I don't remember a lot. All I can remember is that one day we had the enormous amount of aeroplanes coming over and the thundering sound of the aircraft going over the bungalow. I can remember the noise and all of them going over. Just after the war, this was. Oh, well, no, it must have been in the wartime. There, billeted in a bungalow next door to us was a family from Portsmouth, because, of course, they were bombed terribly, and they were evacuated to this house next door. And the girl was 2 years younger than I was, Sheila, and we got on very well and used to have fun together. And we had a sort of ditch or stream at the bottom of the garden. We used to be able to climb over there and pick blackberries when the cows weren't looking and things like that. And we also had a little shed in our garden, and we draped curtains all around the tools, and so that it looked very nice, like a little house. And we used to sit there, and I used to read to her. Funny stories, Enid Blyton's funny stories in those days. And we used to beg our parents so that we could sleep out there, but they would never let us. And then they got very cross. My father got very cross because he could see the shed that we were in at the end of the path towards the back door, and we had written in chalk "Cosy Cottage" on it. Obviously childlike writing, and he was very cross about this. I can remember having to scrub it off. When I was 12, the grammar schools were in Chichester, and I used to have to get the bus, and there was a lady opposite who was very strict, and she was a vicar's wife, retired vicar's wife, and she told my mother that I would come to no good because when I ran for the bus, my skirts were flying. And on the bus I met my husband-to-be. No, I did not like him at first, but my friend Avril did like him, so she persuaded me to sit next to her so that he would talk to us on the bus. Definitely into aeroplanes, yes, with his friend Ray, who then became head of Hendon. And they used to do all this zooming about, talking about aeroplanes, and all the latest aeroplanes and latest aircraft and that sort of thing. We didn't have that many celebrations that I can remember because we were a sort of village. But my father had, his boss had this enormous house on the outskirts of Bognor, and I was invited to go with my sister and our friends. Oh, we just had to dress in our best clothes. So we did see the television on this little television, black and white television. And I can vividly remember the Queen, she was all in white, you know, being crowned. It was very exciting. In the 1950s, it was very difficult because we had very little equipment, and we used to have to, for the children, we used to have to build things like puppet theatres. When I was in Streatham, I went to First Down College in Streatham, and I can remember we had to go to the market to ask the chaps there if we could have their boxes, their fruit boxes, and make things out of the boxes and for the children. And we didn't have a lot of paper to write our thesis on and things like that. It was a very difficult time. I lived in Streatham, of course, but we had to do school practices in East End, in Hackney, do a 6 weeks at school practice. And that's when we made things like puppet theatres for the children. And I remember Christopher's father, my husband's father, making me a hutch for my guinea pigs and saying to me, you know, Daphne, there are some people that do things and some people that get things done for them. I shall always remember that. But I also remember carrying that guinea pig cage across the underground, which was quite an experience in the crowded underground in London. When I was teaching, my first job that I had, there were men and women, and that was the only time that I thought that I would strike, because there was an elderly lady teaching with me, and she was teaching, looking after her mother, and then there was a young man who hardly did any work, and we didn't have equal pay. And I always felt that that was very unjust, because he wasn't doing as much work as she was. The accommodation, where we had a room, but if ever we had any chaps in, we had to put the bed outside in the corridor, which today sounds absolutely ridiculous. But that was the situation that it was. But it was good. It was good. We had lots of friends, and it was great fun. My husband worked for the British Council, and we were posted to Libya, and in Libya he was in charge of all the teachers at the university and the teachers in the schools, the British teachers in the schools and the British teachers at the university. We had a flat overlooking the Med, and about 3 flights up, and my daughter was 11 months old, and we had the pushchair. We had to hump up these steps, but it looked very beautiful from there to look out of the windows. And once we saw Onassis yacht coming across in full sail, because it was very near the harbour. We did have enormous cockroaches, enormous brown cockroaches, and you had to keep everything covered in Tupperware and everything put away. But if you went down in the night and put the light on, there was a big scurry, and all the cockroaches disappeared. The surface was brown until they all went. When you went out into the desert and you sat there, it was very stony to start with, and then you got more to the sand. But you didn't sit there very long before somebody came along, one of the Arabs or somebody. Libyans were not supposed to drink. They used to take their beer bottles out and smash them across the edge of the sea, the green milk bottles. We used to have these sort of sandstorms where the sand would come down and like a great big wind, and it was a sort of hot sand on you and covered the car and everything. That was intriguing. Daddy went out to amphitheatres and was in a play when I left. And the toilet was the other side of the amphitheatre, and all the little children were marched across when they were doing the play to go to the loo. I can remember that. It was June, and then Chris used to work in the mornings, and he used to have the afternoons off and go back and work in the evenings. And we went in the afternoon on the beach with Candy, and were enjoying the sun. And she used to wear a huge hat, and so did I. But it was quite fun. And then we came home, and the next day my husband went off to work, and then he rang me on the phone and said, "Keep in, because there's trouble, and I'm coming home." And he came home from the office, and on the way he got a lot of food from the Jewish shop, and we stayed indoors, because apparently there was a problem in Israel, and the Arabs thought that the British were helping. We weren't, but we couldn't persuade them that. And so we had the radio, the forces radio, that we could listen to. And as we listened to the radio, they were giving messages out saying that all British citizens pack one knife, fork and spoon and clothes in a suitcase and be prepared for evacuation. And so we did as we were told, but as we were looking out of the window, we could see the library of the Americans had used on fire, and people being taken across on the rooftops to safety. And there was a lot of rioting going on. And as we looked out of the window across the promenade, we could see crowds and crowds of Libyans shouting, "Nasser, Nasser, Nasser." And at that time, we could hear a car horn going on. and we thought it might be our car, but we couldn't do anything about it, so we just had to hope for the best. And then all day long we just watched things going on and singing songs and playing with Candy, and she enjoyed it. And then we went to bed and we were absolutely thoroughly exhausted. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, we had a phone call from one of Chris's colleagues saying, "Are you ready? Are you ready?" And they said that we were to go downstairs in with our case and everything, and to collect our car and go round to the square, which was the other side of the building, and which we did. And fortunately, the car was fine. And as we were going down the stairs, Candy was saying pretty lights, look, and things like that. But the chap at the bottom, the gaffer, ignored us and smiled. And off we went. And as we got round the corner, there were soldiers with boulders in their hands and big lorries and a stream of cars that were going through to the barracks where the Inniskillen guards were there. And they looked after us for 6 days and 6 nights. I was, we were both into a big hangar, and they managed to get a mattress for Chris and myself and a little cot of Candy. And I used to have to wash Candy's clothes and things in a little sink. And I remember being there one day and a German woman came in and she said to me, "You do realise, of course, that they could keep us here for 4 years because I was interned in England." So it was a bit of a cheerful thing for her to say. But on the whole, everybody was very, very chatty and happy, and we used to have to queue up for our meals. And the army fed us very well indeed. And then we used to have to go and meet in a square, and the Consul General used to say, "It is not safe for you to go back into your homes yet," and tell us what was going on. And they used to come down in helicopters, and of course all the sand would come up. And one of our friends had an aeroplane, and Chris went out with him because we were in charge of students that were doing things like that and degrees, and they were out with the Bedouin, but we couldn't find one of them. And then suddenly he appeared because his Libyan friends heard them saying about they should be going to the barracks, and got all his stuff for him, put them in the car and drove him to the barracks. But one of our great friends, who was one of the teachers' wives, had a baby, and she had a baby in the Adventist hospital, the American hospital out there, and she needed to get to the British barracks. And so the Libyan ambulance driver drove there. But of course, when she got to the barracks, the soldiers pulled their guns because they didn't recognise her. And she was in the back of the ambulance with little Emily saying, "I just had a baby and I'm British." So they let her in, fortunately. But then she and her husband flew out quite soon because he'd finished his time as a teacher out there, so they flew out. And some people flew out, and all the Americans, they decided that they should be taken out, and they were all put in coaches ready to go out, but they couldn't get their aircraft in to get them because the Libyans didn't want to go out to fight, and they were coming up and down into the airport. So those poor souls were sat there for hours in the heat waiting to go. But of course the British stayed. And we were there for 6 days and 6 nights, and then we were told we could go back. But I went back with you to a bungalow outside Benghazi because Daddy felt it would be safer. And then when we did go back to our flat, Libyans still were a bit, they used to bang on the car and things like that. And so, as I promised him when I married that I would obey him, he said he wanted me to go home with my daughter. So I went home. We had permission to go out under curfew. And I went back via Rome on my own. When I got home, my mother had very kindly, because it was a difficult time to sell our house, and we thought we were going to Libya for 4 years. So she gave up her bungalow in Sussex and came to look after our house in Kent, and she was on holiday. So my friend who lived down the road, she had the key. So my mother didn't know that we had come back until she came back a week later when I was more settled.